of course, it's been dismissed, and Heyerdahl generally has been dismissed. Why? Because he doesn't have any degrees. He doesn't fit into that academic thing. Oh, you've got to have peer-reviewed papers to even entertain a new idea or have a new idea. But in Early Man in the Oceans, he presents some very, very convincing evidence of how people moved around the oceans, particularly with the distribution of certain animals and plants. For example, the distribution of the sweet potato and the distribution of pigs and the distribution of red hair around the world. And these things raise all sorts of interesting questions, and he's basically arguing that when you start to look at the pattern of ocean currents and how people would move with those ocean currents, then it starts to make some sense. And the red hair one is particularly interesting, and some of this is now being confirmed with DNA tracing and so on. But the ocean currents, of course, are what people are familiar with to some extent, but they actually the surface ocean currents only operate in the top approximately 3,000 feet of water, and they are driven by the winds. And there is a distinct pattern to them, and of course they have a huge influence on regional climates. And for example, and you've got this going on now with talk about the oil coming out of the Gulf and getting into the Gulf Stream.
And I'd like you to talk about that when you get to it. I'd really like you to say some things about what your perspective is on what's going on from the oceanic level, when you can.
Yeah, well, and of course the transport of that heat energy from and people incorrectly say, oh, the Gulf Stream goes to the western part of Europe. It doesn't. It's only the Gulf Stream as it comes out of the Gulf and then moves up the eastern seaboard of the United States. But once it gets off the coast of Cape Cod and on eastern Canada, it is then driven by the westerly winds and becomes the North Atlantic Drift, which is the proper term for it. And this is one of the greatest movements of water and energy anywhere on the planet. It's huge. And I just tell an interesting little story about this. We were sent out very early one morning in our aircraft, our anti-submarine aircraft, because a Canadian Navy had lost two pilots in a survival dinghy. What they were doing was doing ocean survival training, and they put these two pilots into this rubber dinghy, put them over the side of the destroyer, and when the sun rose in the morning, they were gone. And of course, there was a big panic, and the reason was because the destroyer was holding its position using GPS and staying in one place, whereas the dinghy was at the mercy of the Gulf Stream, the North Atlantic Drift there, and was being carried towards Europe at about 12 knots. And they didn't allow for this. And of course, they had no idea that it would travel that far in that short a time. Now, by the way, Benjamin Franklin understood this, and I might have mentioned this before, but it's worth commenting again about people with much wider understanding of things, which makes them great leaders and great visionaries. But Franklin, who was the first postmaster general, wanted to speed up mail traveling between France and the U.S. because of the Revolutionary War, and he gave the ship's captains carrying the post thermometers, so that they could travel with the North Atlantic Drift going to Europe and avoid it coming back to the Americas.
Oh, interesting.
And that speeded up the rate of mail delivery by 5 full days, which is, as I said, it's a measure of why he is such a remarkable man in history. But of course, this is, as I say, what makes visionaries and these people so great. But it's an awareness of nature in the oceans. And so the surface currents are very important. But just to give you an idea of how recent our understanding of all of these currents are, even during my career, once I got into the university in the 69 and 70, they were starting to talk about something called the Walker circulation. This is a New Zealand scientist who was looking at the fact that there appeared to be a pattern to the pressure and the winds in the subtropics around New Zealand. And he proposed this idea of the ocean currents in the subtropics in the Pacific reversing themselves, that the water was flowing in one direction at one time and then flowing in the opposite direction at another time. Now this, of course, gradually over time, it became known as the El Nino effect, and now it's known as ENSO, or the El Nino Southern Oscillation. But now, that's only come into the modern scientific literature since about 1970. But here's the amusing thing about it, Kim, is that when Sir Francis Drake set off on his voyage around the world, and he got around Cape Horn and into the Pacific as the first British sailor to do that, the very first thing he did was captured a Spanish vessel and took on the navigator from that Spanish vessel to help him cope with these different currents, the El Nino currents in the Pacific Ocean. And the Spanish knew about them, and of course that's where the name came from, El Nino, the Christ child, because they occur around Christmas time. And also, of course, the Spanish learned about them from the Inca, who were sailing their rafts to the Galapagos, and they knew there were periods of time when they simply couldn't overcome and get out to the islands off the coast of South America because the winds and the currents had reversed themselves. So we're back to almost to Thor Heyerdahl, an early man in the oceans, and so on. So what we're seeing is that primitive peoples, in many ways, had a better and more empirical understanding of things, and that somehow, because we're now discovering it scientifically, that this is something new. And of course, it's made even worse because a lot of people think, oh, well, El Nino, well, that's something that's being caused by humans because it's just been recently discovered. It's absolute nonsense. And there are marvelous records of reconstructing El Nino events going back 300, 400, 500 years, but of course they go much longer than that. And by the way, another example of the relationship between these oceans and the ocean currents and the weather was that the potato was the primary crop, the basic food supply for the Inca people. And, of course, when to plant that potato crop was critical because of the rainfall patterns on the coast of South America. So what would happen is every spring, the leaders, the priests, and so on would go up into the high mountains, and they would make observations of a group of stars called the Pleiades, and depending upon whether the Pleiades were sparkling or twinkling, or whether they were very clear, they would then make a call and say, okay, we'll plant the potatoes early, or no, we'll delay the planting, because they knew by experience that the atmospheric conditions were telling them whether there was going to be an early rainfall or a late rainfall. What they didn't know, of course, was that what was causing the changing view of the Pleiades was changing of the optic conditions of the atmosphere because of the El Nino, La Nina reversal of currents and the temperatures and the heat rising and so on. So these interconnections are just amazing and historically when you start to dig into them. But as I said, here we are arrogantly thinking, oh, well, we've got satellites up there and we know all about the oceans and we know all about what's going on. And nothing could be further from the truth.
Do you remember when we were preparing to do the show on peer review that you had talked about, was it you that talked about Sir Francis Drake, that there was new information about him? Is that something you can share right now or not really?
Yeah, very quickly. Francis Drake, of course, and by the way, I would love to do a program with you on Elizabeth I, who I happen to think is, without question, the greatest leader of all time in any country. The only person I would put even close to her is Catherine the Great. And